The fly problem. Once upon a time in a peaceful pond, there were many frogs, but not enough flies. The frogs loved to eat flies, but no matter how fast they hopped or how high they leapt, there were never enough flies to satisfy their hunger. The flies were so scarce that the frogs began to feel the effects. Just across the pond in neighboring flyland, flies grew in abundance. But there were very few frogs around to catch them. The flies in flyland were practically swarming, ready for a hungry frog to snack on. The frogs in the pond realized they had a solution right next door. Flyland. They could buy their flies from there. The flies were so plentiful that they could be sold at very low prices, meaning the frogs could satisfy their cravings without much effort. Everyone was happy. Flyland made money selling flies, and the frogs got to feast. This is called importing. When a country or pond buys something from another country, it's importing. In this case, the frogs were importing flies from Flyland. When a country sells goods to another, that's exporting, so Flyland was exporting flies. It seemed like a win-win. The tariff appears, but then the Frogland government, always looking for ways to make more money, decided to get involved. What if we put a tariff on flies from Flyland? They thought. A tariff is like a tax, an extra charge added when bringing goods from one country into another. So the frogs now had to pay extra to bring the flies into Frogland. It's like ordering a delicious meal from a restaurant. You pay for the food, but also a delivery fee. That extra fee is like a tariff. The frogs still paid for the flies, but now they had to pay the government too. Because of the tariff, the cost of flies in Frogland went up. The frogs still had access to cheap flies, but they were no longer as cheap. Naturally, the frogs weren't thrilled. How tariffs work? Here's where it gets interesting. Tariffs can be calculated in a couple of ways. A fixed amount, like charging 2 lily pads per fly, or a percentage of the fly's price, like 10% more per fly. Most frog countries use percentage tariffs. It's simpler and sounds fancier. They even have a name for it, adorum. Tariffs can also vary depending on the product. For example, young flies, tender and small, might have one tariff, and older flies with more flavor might have another. The more bureaucratic the frog government gets, the more complicated the rules become. Trade terms and balancing imports and exports. When Frogland doesn't use tariffs, it's called free trade. Goods move freely, with no extra charges. But if Frogland buys more than it sells, it ends up with a trade deficit, spending more lily pads than it's earning. If Frogland sells more than it buys, that's a trade surplus, like having more flies to eat than you can catch. Tariffs can affect this balance. If tariffs raise fly prices, frogs might buy fewer imported flies. If local frogs can catch more or sell other products, this might restore balance. If not, the trade deficit grows. It's all about balance. What happens when tariffs are used? So, what happens when a tariff is added? The price of imported flies rises. Suddenly, Flyland's flies aren't so cheap, and local frog fly catchers can raise their prices. Local frogs are happy. They don't have to compete with cheaper flies. But here's the downside. Without competition, quality may drop. Local frogs might work less, flies might shrink in size or flavor, and variety might disappear. The frogs pay more, but the flies aren't necessarily better. Now frogs must choose, pay more for local flies or settle for the pricier imports. The government makes money on each imported fly, but frogs are stuck with fewer options and higher prices. The trade war, a battle of flies. Now let's imagine Flyland doesn't like these tariffs. They retaliate, imposing tariffs on Frogland's exports like lily pads or frog services. This leads to a trade war. A trade war is when countries retaliate by raising tariffs on each other's goods. It's like a who can raise prices more contest. In the end, both sides suffer. Goods become more expensive and economies struggle. The frogs may feel like they're winning, but nobody really wins. Everyone ends up frustrated and poorer. Why do governments use tariffs? So, why does Frogland even impose tariffs? Several reasons. To make local fly markets more appealing out of jealousy or competition. To negotiate better deals with Flyland. And most of all, money. Governments love tariffs because they generate revenue without raising direct taxes. But it comes at a cost. Higher prices and unhappy frogs. Why do we even have tariffs? If tariffs cause all these problems, why keep them? Short answer, money. While governments may claim they help small frog businesses, it's not always true. Some rely on flyland's goods. Tariffs make it harder for them to survive. Big fly companies might survive, but small fly stands, not so much. Frogs pay more, businesses suffer, and frustration builds. The ripple effect of tariffs. Tariffs don't just affect fly prices, they ripple through the entire pond economy. When tariffs increase import costs, fly shops raise prices, frogs pay more. Businesses that depend on imported materials like fly catching tools struggle. Prices go up across the board. It's a domino effect. One increase affects everything. The pond feels the pressure, and long-term damage can follow. The future of tariffs, digital flies and beyond. What about digital flies? As the world evolves, tariffs might target non-physical goods, e-books, AI fly patterns, or virtual fly simulations. New ideas like environmental tariffs could emerge, taxing products based on pollution or ecological damage. If a fly factory pollutes the pond, it might face extra charges. The future of tariffs still uncertain, but it could look very different. The Flyland War, a real-life example. There was a real Flyland War between European and American frogs. In 1993, European frogs gave tariff breaks to Caribbean flies to support the region. American frogs didn't get the deal. They were upset and retaliated, taxing European lily pads and services. This trade war lasted nearly 20 years. The World Frog Organization, WFO, finally stepped in to mediate. Eventually, tariffs were lowered, but it took far too long. A perfect example of how tariffs can escalate quickly. The smart frogs avoiding tariffs through loopholes, but not all frogs were willing to accept higher prices. The smartest frogs began looking for workarounds. Some started buying flies in neighboring Boogistan, where there were no tariffs, then reselling them in Frogland. Others began dismantling flies into parts, buying wings separately, legs separately, then assembling them at home. Technically, these were no longer flies from Flyland, but fly parts for assembly. The Frogland government quickly caught on to this scheme and began introducing more and more rules. But clever frogs always found new loopholes. This shows that tariffs often create an entire industry dedicated to avoiding them. The quota system, when tariffs aren't enough. When tariffs didn't achieve the desired effect, the Frogland government decided to introduce quotas, limits on the number of flies that could be imported. You can only bring in 1,000 flies per month, and that's it, they declared. Now, even if frogs were willing to pay high prices, there simply weren't enough flies for everyone. Lines formed, a black market for flies emerged where prices skyrocketed. Some frogs began hoarding flies for a rainy day, creating artificial shortages. Quotas turned out to be even worse than tariffs. They not only raised prices but created real chaos in the pond's economy. The retaliation spiral. When everyone gets angry, the tariff story quickly escalated beyond anyone's expectations. Flyland didn't just impose retaliatory tariffs, they declared a complete embargo on frog products. In response, Frogland banned not only flies but all other insects from Flyland. Soon other countries joined the conflict. Beetleburg supported Flyland, while Toadtown sided with Frogland. What started as a simple dispute about flies turned into a global trade crisis. Frogs in all countries suffered from high prices and shortages, but no one wanted to back down first. Too much pride was at stake. The innovation paradox, how tariffs can backfire. Unexpectedly, tariffs led to a technological revolution in Frogland. Local frogs, cut off from cheap Flyland flies, began inventing new ways to catch flies. They created super sticky tongues, developed next-generation fly traps, and even learned to breed flies at home. It seemed like tariffs had worked. A local innovation industry emerged. But the paradox was that when these technologies matured, Frogland began exporting them to other countries, including Flyland. In the end, tariffs helped create a competitor that began displacing the original fly producers in the global market. The next generation, digital flies and virtual tariffs. While adult frogs argued about tariffs on real flies, the younger generation found a completely new solution. They began buying virtual flies in the metaverse, digital insects that provided the same satisfaction but weren't subject to tariffs. The government was confused. How do you tax like something that only exists in virtual reality. Some frogs switched completely to a digital diet, others used NFT flies as a new currency. Suddenly, traditional fly trading looked archaic. This showed that in the age of digital technology, tariffs can become completely meaningless. Innovations simply bypass them, creating fundamentally new markets. Conclusion: the big picture. Whether it's flies or lily pads, tariffs are complicated tools. They help governments raise money and protect local businesses, but also cause price hikes, quality issues, and trade wars. Understanding tariffs helps frogs and people make smarter decisions about trade. It's all about finding the right balance, supporting the local economy while keeping goods affordable. Tariffs may not disappear, but we can learn how to manage them better so everyone gets the flies they need.